Welcome to today's American Security Project webinar. This is an on-the-record conversation that will be available for attribution. A recording of this conversation will be posted on our website. All audience members will be muted during the discussion, but please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions to the panelists. With that, I will turn it over to ASP CEO, Patrick Costello.
Thank you, Matthew. Good afternoon from Washington. Welcome to today's virtual conversation. It's day 14 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. By some estimates, nearly 2 million Ukrainians, mostly women and children, have fled. According to the UN, it has now become Europe's fastest growing refugee crisis since World War II. For the war itself, it is not going to plan for President Putin. The Ukrainians are mounting a fierce resistance, and President Zelensky has emerged as a truly inspiring wartime leader. Intense and unprecedented sanctions have been levied on Putin and his regime. The US announced yesterday that we will ban Russian oil imports. The EU is cutting back on Russian oil, but won't join the US in a full ban, while the UK will phase it out by the end of the year. This is a very fast-moving situation. To paraphrase Lenin, there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. And it's certainly too early to tell how this ends. Joining us this afternoon to discuss developments in Ukraine is Baroness Ashton. Baroness Ashton is currently a distinguished fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Institute. It's certainly a well-deserved title. She served in a variety of roles in Tony Blair's Labour government. Baroness Ashton became a leader of the House of Lords and Lord President of the Council in Gordon Brown's first cabinet, and she was instrumental in steering the EU's Treaty of Lisbon through the UK Parliament's upper chamber. Baroness Ashton then served as High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and first Vice President of the European Commission from 2009 to 2014, directing foreign policy for the European Union during Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Crimea in 2014. Her forthcoming book, entitled "And Then What?" is where she tells the story of her experience dealing with a variety of crises, such as the intervention in Libya, the 2014 invasion of Ukraine, negotiating the Iran nuclear deal, among others, and it will be released this fall. Baroness Ashton, thank you for joining us. Let's get right into it. And I'd actually like to start by having you reflect on your experience in 2014. One of the things I've been struck by is alliance cohesion. The US and NATO allies are completely aligned on this for the moment. It's a stark difference from when Russia initially invaded in 2014, when there were divisions within the alliance and within EU member states. And just your thoughts on how this episode is different, and discuss how you negotiated the intra-European politics during the 2014 invasion and annexation of Crimea.
Patrick, it's wonderful to be joining you and the audience at this extraordinary time. We're all very conscious of events in Ukraine and the tragedy and horror that is unfolding before us. I do reflect back to the beginning, if you like, where all this started, when we saw the taking of Crimea and what was done in Luhansk and Donetsk to create the circumstances where, if you like, Ukraine was not able to operate as a whole nation. At that time, there was the inevitable conversations about how best to tackle this problem. It wasn't that member states of the European Union were unwilling to do something. The question was, what was the best thing to do? For some, it was very clear that we should move to maximum sanctions. We should be pushing even then to remove Russia from SWIFT. And for others, it was more about getting Russia into the room to negotiate, and a feeling that to do that, we had to be cautious about how strong the sanctions should be. We've learned a lot since then. One of the things we've learned from other experiences is that this twin-pronged approach, maximum pressure and always having the opportunity for negotiation, needs to be done at the same time and needs to be done as strongly as possible. We need to get not just people's attention, but actually make a difference in determining what actions follow. And so what we see now is an alliance that is very much hanging together, a cohesion about what we should do based on experience, a recognition that we want to keep the pressure on, and always finding ways to either directly or indirectly promote the conversation, the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, and to, if you like, apply pressure to see that happen as well.
Thank you, Kathy. Sticking on the intra-European politics, one thing I have been struck by is Germany. One of the more surprising aspects of alliance management and the response from NATO has been Germany's true about face. They now appear quite serious about ending decades of rapprochement with Moscow. For years, Germany was in line with not sending weapons into war zones, had refused to give Ukraine a single bullet to help it defend itself against Russian aggression, but they've since turned around and changed course. So what are your thoughts on Chancellor Scholz's moves here?
I think everybody was surprised at the complete change that he instigated within Germany. But I think we have to reflect on a couple of things. The first is, again, as I was saying, that in the years building up to this, there's been a lot of reflection about what sort of approach is going to be most effective. Is it better to keep talking? Generally, I think we all agree that keeping talking is an important element, but not necessarily the only thing. And also that Germany was very conscious of its own past, and that has made it hesitate to engage in the build-up of its own defences, of its own military, because of those reflections. And I think with Chancellor Scholz, first of all, he's just arrived in office and this crisis has almost arrived with him. So he needs to not only reflect on his own coalition and the politics within his own government, but also on public opinion in Germany and looking to the broader questions of what he ought to do in conjunction with his allies. And so without excusing him, this is a new chancellor trying to deal with a very, very difficult set of circumstances. And I think he has made it clear now where Germany is going to go, that its determination to address the 2% of GDP on defense, its determination to be part of this strong alliance, challenging Russia for its actions.
I want to talk about refugees for a moment. You've had a front row seat to Europe's refugee crisis in prior stages of your career. And by some estimates, again, between 1.5 and 2 million Ukrainians have fled their country, seeking safety in nearby Poland, Romania, Moldova. And the UN has said that Europe's fastest growing refugee crisis since the Second World War. But I've been quite struck by how welcoming Europeans have been to Ukrainian refugees. Just how long do you think this can last? The system will crack at some point. Is there a number at which in Poland, the support system will get overwhelmed? How long can there be financial resources dedicated to it? And how long can we maintain solidarity beyond the first few days of this conflict?
One of the things that's been really interesting, Patrick, in looking at this crisis is how welcoming families and individuals have been all over Europe. You hear it everywhere. People opening the doors and saying, we will have somebody come stay with us. Please, come and feel able to be part of our community and our family while you have to be out of your own country. The amount of money that's been raised in individual countries has been extraordinary. It's been a real response, and that's partly because there's a recognition that this is on the European mainland. This is our territory, if you like, and a recognition that this has been visited on people in ways that were unthinkable even a few weeks ago. And we are seeing the consequences live on our screens every day by brave journalists and commentators out there making sure that we get the information. So the first thing to say is I think this is genuine. I think it's probably long-lived. Having said that, Filippo Grandi, who's the UN Commissioner for Refugees, will be the first one to say you still need a concerted and thought out plan for how you're going to manage refugees who may be with us in different countries, for a considerable period of time. There's been a move to get extended visas, so we're seeing that for 3 years, which is really important. We hope this crisis will be over long before then, but you and I both know that it's also possible it will last much longer. So I think we will see a continuation of the effort, but it will require coordination. It will require the European Union, the Commission in Brussels, to think through how best to support people in the longer term. And it will require a global effort, really, to support and maintain them.
Great, thank you. I'm going to pose one more question to Kathy before we invite questions from our audience. Kathy, just yesterday, there was an open letter released by a number of foreign policy heavyweights calling for a limited no-fly zone. It was signed by folks like former Supreme Allied Commander for Europe, General Phil Breedlove, Paula Dobriansky, Eric Edelman, former ambassador to Turkey, Bill Taylor, former ambassador to Ukraine, Sandy Vershbow, former ambassador to NATO. Your thoughts on the imposition of either a limited or full no-fly zone on over Ukraine, the wisdom of that policy?
Look, some of the people who signed this letter are people I highly respect, and they would be people who recognize the challenge of the no-fly zone. It's a concept that sounds, when you first hear it, as something almost benign, you know, something that's positive. And to that extent it is, except that the only way that it can be put in place is either by creating the circumstances where nothing can fly. That means attacking airfields, it means knocking out radar, or the circumstances where if something does fly, you are prepared to take action against it. And the challenge of that, which I think Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, has laid out extremely well, is that you then escalate the conflict, because the only way that could be done would be through NATO states getting involved. And if you escalate the conflict, you risk it escalating and spiraling out of control. In many ways, the thing that I think people on the ground need is support to be able to challenge the Russians as they arrive in their villages and towns and cities. And that means providing them with a kind of equipment, including the sort of body armor that will protect them when they're confronting these armed forces.
So, sorry, just to piggyback on that before we turn to questions from the audience, can you dive down a bit deeper on exactly what type of equipment we should be sending? Is it additional javelins, additional stingers, just boxes and boxes and tons of ammo? What do you think is the appropriate type of assistance?
Well, I think those who are looking and reflecting with military strategy at their fingertips and their deep knowledge will be saying, this is an urban conflict. This is about people street by street in the end actually fighting. And if that is the case, then what people need is to be as protected as possible, because we know there are many people who may fight who are not in the armed forces, who've not been trained. So they are people who are potentially more vulnerable to that extent. They need to have armor, they need to have night vision goggles, they need to have helmets. They also need to have the weapons that are going to be useful to them, that they can carry and that they can use. And of course, the ammunition that goes with that. But there'll be people looking at this, I'm sure, and thinking through what needs to happen. But it's going to be in a way that basic equipment that will be used in the kind of fighting that I anticipate we might see, unless we can find a way to get a ceasefire and stop the conflict.
We've got a question from John Wall asking about the political realities and at what point does the US and its allies say that enough is enough with the civilian casualties? I guess you could almost call this the CNN effect of the war. How much will that push us towards some type of intervention similar to what we experienced in the Balkans? Just the public pressure saying enough is enough and we can no longer stand this carnage.
It's a really good question. And I think the answer is we don't know how this is going to develop. There's going to be enormous pressure for us to do as much as possible. There's going to be enormous pressure to find ways to wind the conflict down, to stop the Russian invasion and attack, and to use all of the different forces that we can. So, for example, We know that President Xi of China was talking with President Macron and Chancellor Scholz yesterday. We know that the Turkish foreign ministers invited the foreign ministers of Ukraine and Russia for dialogue. There is already the beginnings of the efforts to try and get this conflict to be stopped, and efforts to wind it down. And that's really got to be the focus for the next period. But undoubtedly, if the casualties increase and as things spiral, there will be more pressure to find ways to try and stop it.
President, this is a question from the chat. President Zelensky has recently asked for Ukrainian membership into the European Union. What would that require? Can you tell us about the steps that would need to happen in Brussels as well as in the capitals of member nations?
So as well as it being a kind of political statement of joining the European Union, of, in a sense, taking part in the democratic values of the Union, it's also a huge economic step. And in a sense, the European Union began with that very strong economic underpinning that offered opportunity for nations to work together. It takes a long time. All countries that have joined into the European Union will tell you that it takes years to bring your regulation, your legal systems, your economic system into line, shall I call it that, but into a way of being that is going to be compatible with the EU. So it's not just, something that can be offered and given immediately. It's something that is a long and difficult process. And there is much, much more that in normal time, if we had peacetime, that Ukraine would have to do before it could even be considered properly. Now, we're not in normal times, and there is a very strong push from some member states to say, look, these are extraordinary circumstances. We need to find a way to offer something to Ukraine. And I think those debates are going to go on within Brussels, within the meetings of ministers over these next weeks.
Whenever and however this conflict ends, it will end through mediation, through diplomacy. We have a question in the chat from Michael Wu, just asking your thoughts on the role as Israel as a moderator. Prime Minister Bennett has had his own version of shuttle diplomacy, meeting with Putin. He's conferred with colleagues and counterparts in Europe. Here in the States, he's met with President Zelensky. So what do you think of using their good offices?
Look, I think there are a number of countries who are really keen, and Israel is one, to try and offer either a location or a mediator role to enable the parties to come together. It's a really important role to play, and I've played it myself. And it enables the parties to meet on neutral territory, if you like, to meet with people that they both trust, and to meet in circumstances where they can try and find a way through. The first thing you need to achieve it is a willingness on both sides to do that. And I think it's fantastic to see countries coming forward. It's good to see the efforts that are being made to recognize that in the end, this is what we have to do, is actually sit down and stop this. But it will have to be done when we're able to be confident that both sides, and this is of course applicable to Russia in particular, are prepared to come and sit down. And at the moment, what you've got is vague possibilities, but often with preconditions that Russia is trying to set, that for President Zelensky would be unacceptable. And that's also important. If you're mediating, you're not imposing what you think is going to happen.
Right. One interesting actor in all of this has been President Erdogan of Turkey. There's a question in the chat to that effect. Just your thoughts on his role generally, but also when you look at the map, Turkey is the only NATO member state that can materially affect Russia's access to the conflict zone by virtue of it controlling the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus. So they are in a very, very delicate position. So your thoughts on Turkey and Erdogan, please.
I think we were probably all a bit surprised, but pleasantly surprised, when the Foreign Minister of Turkey, Cavusoglu, said this is a war and talked about the Montreux Convention. I think most people expected that Turkey would keep away from that. Now, that allows them to say you cannot move ships across the waters into the Black Sea if you are doing so in order to continue your war or your aggression. They can only move if they're going home to their home port. And that, I think, is an important moment where Turkey has said that it does recognize what's going on here as being aggression, that it is about invasion, and has done the one thing that it can do within the legal framework that is without NATO. It's outside of that, but has also been very, very quick to offer opportunities for the two sides to come together. And it may be that Istanbul is a place where negotiation could happen. From my own experience, by the way, I was in Istanbul negotiating on the Iran talks on a number of occasions, and certainly meeting bilaterally the Iranians many times there. So Istanbul could be a place. And as I said, what's really, really important is that these offers continue, because they're the way of finding, in a sense, the moment when mediation can happen and where and who that might be.
I think we also do have to recognize that Erdogan's in a tough spot here because of Russia's activities in northern Syria. He's got to play a very very delicate dance. I want to turn a bit to your thoughts on the economic dynamics of this conflict. There's been an imposition of an incredible amount of sanctions on the Putin regime, but they tried to insulate themselves by creating a so-called fortress economy with some $650 billion in foreign currency reserves. A lot of those are actually held outside of Russia, so access to that has been denied. But just your thoughts on the economic dynamics here. How long will how much pain can Putin and his inner circle absorb on the economic front?
President Putin has always said, really, that the economic pain is not for him the issue that will turn him away from what he believes is the thing he wants to do. And the very inner circle, though it's a very opaque system, so I don't pretend that we know exactly every aspect of who he's talking to, who he's most close to on this issue, but they are not affected in the same way as what we've learned to call oligarchs. The very rich business people within Russia are going to be affected, and we can all cite the different sanctions that have been put upon them. I think there are two things that need to be reflected on. One is that there has been a tremendous, almost global effort to try and put the right kind of economic pressure on to show that the world is not prepared to accept the invasion of Ukraine. And I think also a recognition that for the Russian people, this is also going to be of enormous importance, because sanctions affect them. They affect the people and the entities you're directly sanctioning. And we need to remember too that the countries who are putting on strong sanctions will themselves be affected. There is always a domestic cost, particularly on energy prices, which already many countries were concerned about, but also in other aspects of trade and economic life. So there's a lot to be thought about in the sanctions we currently have. And I think an important factor in all this is to be looking for other ways to increase the pressure in more economic sanctions or different economic sanctions, bearing in mind, as you rightly said, that there are strong reserves in Russia, even if they can't access a lot of the resources outside.
Let's continue down this pulling this energy thread. I think it's a critical moment for global energy policy. Russia is the world's third largest producer of crude, producing approximately 10% of the world's oil, second largest natural gas producer. And you've seen moves to cut off use of Russian oil from a variety of countries in the West. And I'm wondering, could this serve to accelerate a transition to clean energy, accelerate our efforts to decarbonize our economy? I'm just hoping for some silver on the edge of a very dark cloud.
Well, I think that could be the bit of silver on the edge of the very dark cloud, because it does mean we have to put our minds very firmly towards what are we going to do in terms of energy for the future, and the potential to now invest massively in supporting our climate change agenda, which is incredibly important, for the world. And trying to do that on the back of this may be a way to, if you like, find the positive within it. It's very challenging to do. We've been looking at energy issues for a long time, certainly in Europe. The first map I ever put on the wall when I became High Representative was a map of the kind of the pipelines of where our energy resources came from. And for a lot of those places, even back in 2009, there was a question about stability. And then we had what happened in Libya. We've had, of course, the challenges from Russia and the East. And energy has been a huge political question. So now, more than ever, it's a time to start looking at alternative sources, start looking about collaboration with partners who we can trust for the longer term, and about reflecting on what our energy needs are going to be in the future and moving quickly to try and resolve those. Recognizing that for many families across Europe, and I imagine across the United States, rising energy prices is a real challenge.
Indeed, it is. If anyone's gone to gas up their car in the past week, they've certainly felt a bit of a pinch in the wallet. Several questioners are asking about dynamics within Russia. So as Putin carries out this unrelenting war against Ukraine, he's sought to impose an information blockade and martial law within Russia to isolate the access to information from the Russian people. So just wondering the degree to which he can maintain that block on information streams. I think this will probably break once soldiers start to go back either severely harmed or in body bags. Communities will start to really push back. And could this serve as a grassroots push against Putin?
I agree with you completely, Patrick. I mean, this is the most obvious way that people will get first-hand, second-hand information about what's going on, is when people start returning. Tragically, some will return having been killed. Tragically, some will return having been injured. All of them will return who have not been killed with stories about what was actually going on. And that, I think, is going to be the huge source of information to people in Russia about the reality of this. But also, it's really hard to turn information off these days, much, much more complicated, as many countries who've tried to restrict the information that people receive have discovered. And so I'm not at all convinced that he's able to do that. And the stories and the reality will start to get out, and then we shall see how the Russian people react.
You've met Vladimir Putin. I want to turn a bit and get your thoughts on his state of mind. Just yesterday in the House, CIA Director Burns said in testimony that the challenge Putin faces is that he has no sustainable political endgame in the face of what will be continued opposition and resistance from Ukrainians. Honourable Haynes, Director of National Intelligence, then said, Putin understands this is a conflict he can't afford to lose. So there's a lot of risk and a lot of concern in this current moment. So just if you can channel the mind of Putin and how he's thinking about these matters. And I question whether or not he's even a rational actor at this point.
It's really difficult to know the details of all of this. And I'm always reluctant to just assume it's somebody who's lost it. We have to assume that this is rationality at its worst, and not just something that we can put in a box and label. We have to work through what it is that he's actually trying to do, and then work out how to stop him. Now, for me, he's somebody who is very fixated on the historical nature of the greatness of Russia, that he sees this as a nation that has been put in a corner and ignored, that he sees that Russia and the lands around it should be regarded as a strong regional, if not a sort of superpower country. And he cannot countenance, in his own terms, the countries that he considers either to be part of Russia wrongly or to have been part of something that was a sort of greater Russia, if you like, could want to move away and to pick up another system to become something completely different. I think, it's about history and it's about legacy. It's about, he does not want to be the Russian leader who sees countries like Ukraine move away completely from a strong relationship with Russia. And that motivation has translated and transformed itself over these years into being a determination to make sure it can't happen. And that determination has translated into deciding to take it back, based probably on what he was able to do in Crimea, based on the extension of what he saw happening in Luhansk and Donetsk. And I don't know whether he thought Ukraine would just welcome him with open arms. I have no idea why he would think that. But a belief that this, in the end, is what ought to happen. And I think we have to confront and challenge him on that level of his own rationality and say, no, this is not acceptable. This is a free nation that makes its own choices. He has certainly lost Ukraine. The question now is how to stop the military action and find a way that's going to de-escalate this to the point where Ukraine is able to rebuild and for its people to be able to go home. And that, I'm afraid, could be a long-term challenge.
In terms of what might de-escalate or potential off-ramps for Putin, I think we all recognize that he needs to save face in order to de-escalate. He needs to be able to say in some way, shape, or form to the Russian people that he's won something. What do you think those off-ramps are? Is it formally saying that, okay, Russia now controls Crimea? I mean, de facto they do, but you say it de jure, that's part of Russia. Or you recognize the areas in the east that he's said are independent republics. What off-ramps are there?
I think this is down to President Zelensky and his best judgment about what he thinks would be acceptable. When you find yourself, as he has done, in the most extraordinary of circumstances, and what courage he has demonstrated, what willingness to keep the communications open to his people and to keep the world aware of the circumstances that so many of his people are suffering right now. He has to think about what he believes is the right thing to do. And when you get to the point where people are being killed, civilians are being killed in circumstances that one could argue, the International Criminal Court is looking at and so on, then it's harder and harder to say, well, we could make a concession here or a concession there, because people have given their lives. And so only he can really make those judgments about what is in the best interests of his country. He will be as mindful as we are about the need to find ways to de-escalate this, that allows for the fact that it's not about a victory for Putin under any circumstances, but it is about why would he de-escalate? What is there that could perhaps make that happen? Is it about no missiles from NATO anywhere near his country? Is it about not hosting missiles from other nations? Is it about something else? I don't know. But only he can do that. And our job is to try and support him in finding those solutions. What it cannot be is a deal that is kind of without him, and that's really, really important, that it's about what he believes is right for his country.
Yeah, I think what Putin wants is to be seen as the leader of a great power, of a superpower, and be on the level of the United States and negotiate directly with the United States over this conflict. The one thing that we need to keep in mind is that the Ukrainians need to maintain agency throughout this crisis. you brought up the ICC, and I want to talk a bit about accountability. With the invasion, Ukraine has filed a case against Russia in the International Court of Justice. That's a state-to-state dispute reconciliation mechanism within the ICC. That is an institution that was established to provide for individual accountability for atrocity crimes. So we've seen at the state level the act of aggression. We've seen at the individual level, at the commander level, just today with the bombing of civilian targets in a hotel with dozens of children in it, atrocity crimes at the individual level. So how do you see the accountability mechanism here playing out as we get deeper into this conflict?
I think it's really important that people who are participating in these terrible atrocities, in this terrible conflict, understand that there is an accountability, not just at the top, important though that is, but actually all the way down, and that they will be held to account for their participation. That's the first thing, because it's not always understood, and it needs to be understood that they will be held to account. And in these days where everybody can take a photograph, everybody can do a video, it in a sense is easier to show that accountability. I think the second aspect of it is to recognize that finding a way through to a peaceful resolution requires each side and all of us to talk to people who have behaved badly in war, who have been part of this conflict. And that, again, comes from the top down. And so it's always a challenge to get the accountability right, to make sure that people understand that and are prepared for it, and if not prepared for it, nevertheless are held to account, and also to recognize that you don't make peace with people who have done other than participate in war.
And we also have to recognize that sometimes the architects of a fragile peace are also the architects of atrocities, and it's a very difficult balancing act to strike. I want to talk about nuclear weapons briefly. On the 27th of February, Putin issued an apocalyptic threat by putting Russia's nuclear forces on alert and warned that any country that interfered with his war in Ukraine would face, quote, consequences that you have never considered before. Now, I think this reflects his frustration and desperation, and his emotional statements suggest some instability. But I'm wondering your thoughts. Do you think the elevated readiness of the Russian nuclear forces is rhetorical flourish, or are we really talking about the real prospect of using nuclear weapons here?
I think we have to consider all possibilities. The alert that he used is one that is, if you like, inherently defensive, in that it's not an alert that takes you to be the first strike. It's there because you believe you could be being attacked. Whether he did that as a message to say, I'm not actually at this point ready to fire anything, but I am telling you that should you come anywhere near me, that is an option. It's hard to read. But I think you have to assume everything. When you have nations with nuclear weapons, when you have the possibility of tactical nuclear weapons being used, you just have to contemplate that is, however remote, remains a possibility. And I think for those looking particularly from Brussels, from NATO command, they will be very mindful of looking at what these possibilities are. And again, it comes back to the importance of trying to de-escalate this and trying to find a way through, which President Zelensky has been willing to negotiate and discuss very openly with Russian counterparts, sending people to meet with them in Belarus. Not necessarily the most satisfactory of things to be doing. We need to be somewhere where they can actually sit down and work this through properly, but very clear. And so in the thinking about nuclear weapons, we also have to think very carefully that this is about trying to keep this or move this to a de-escalation as fast as possible.
As someone who's watching developments very closely, we're all watching developments very closely, but someone who's watching the response from the West very closely is President Xi Jinping. And there's been a lot in the op-ed pages and on television commentary talking about this alignment between Putin and Xi. They've met some 20 some odd times. They've called each other their best friends. So just your thoughts on how China is viewing this, whether or not China might potentially play some type of mediation role. Yeah, your thoughts on the matter.
So what we know is that for Xi Jinping and for China, the idea of invading a different country is absolutely not at all what they would consider to be something that they would normally support. The second thing I would say about China is that, having worked with them closely on the Iran nuclear deal, they were full participants in the P5+1. They played a substantial role in that, where they saw a number of things happening. First, that this was working as a team effort with a mandate. Secondly, that it was about dealing with something that would have created enormous instability, and they want to see stability. And third, it was not about talking about military action. It was about finding negotiation and working a way through it. And those are important elements when you consider what might be possible with President Xi Jinping and with China itself. No question that Russia listens to China. No question that China has influence on Russia. No question that relations with China, with the US and Europe, are not as we would like them to be, should we put it that way, for this purposes, rather than get into all the detail of that. But there could be an opportunity for China to use its good offices to find ways to help de-escalate this. In their mind, economic issues will be paramount. And I think that's where they'll be looking at this and recognizing the consequences economically will affect them as well as it will affect everyone else. And that's not to say they're not thinking about the crisis in Ukraine or the tragedies of individual families and communities, but it is to say that there is potentially a possibility that Xi Jinping and China will be able to put pressure on and perhaps play a role.
We get time for one more question, and I want to ask you about the risks of escalation and potentially getting into Article 5 territory. I can see a scenario whereby Putin deploys cyber weapons inside of Ukraine that take on a life of their own and spread to NATO member states. This has happened before, most notably in 2017, when Russia's NotPetya malware was unleashed in Ukraine and ended up causing billions of dollars of damage to companies worldwide. So I think that could really be a challenge for NATO if a cyber attack goes through Ukraine to, say, Poland or some other member state, and then they call together the NATO member states to say we need to invoke Article 5. So that's something that really scares me. Just wondering your thoughts on it.
It's very complicated, isn't it? Because we're no longer talking about what we would call warfare in the way that when NATO began and Article 5 was an absolute integral part of that, was very clear and obvious to see. Tanks roll into a NATO country, NATO stands together. It's only been invoked once, as you know, which was by the United States after 9/11, and NATO countries stood together. So looking at issues like cyber warfare, I'm not sure whether what you would have is a NATO response as much as a coordinated response between those countries who've become pretty expert in tackling and dealing with cyber attacks. I'm not sure that you would end up having a military alliance come together with a military response. Now, NATO's been doing its own review, as you know, and it's been looking at issues like cyber warfare, looking at and understanding very well that warfare, as we've known it, has changed considerably. So I don't rule it out. But again, these are all important considerations. And we are in a world, frankly, Patrick, we don't really know what's going to happen next. And you're right to raise all of these different elements, because we have to be mindful that any one of them could be what we're really focused on and thinking about later today, tomorrow, next week, next month. And so important to keep on the agenda and important to keep at the front of our minds.
Well, Kathy, that's all the time we have for this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining me in conversation. Thank you to the audience for some very thoughtful questions. On behalf of the American Security Project, our Consensus for American Security, and all of our friends and guests on the line, I sincerely appreciate you letting us tap into your considerable wisdom and experience to help us try and understand this fast-moving and, quite honestly, anxiety-inducing situation. So I hope we can continue to tap into your expertise, because this situation is not going to resolve itself anytime soon, unfortunately.
Patrick, thank you, and thank you to everyone who's listening. Our thoughts need to be with the people of Ukraine.
Indeed.